All right, so we are now recording. As I said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, both to our panelists and everyone who's been able to join us today. Welcome to Making It Work with a Background in STS, hosted by us, the STS Futures Initiative. We're a graduate student-led virtual series of professional development workshops and events that are tailored to students within the field of science and technology studies, but really open to anyone in the humanities, social sciences who is interested in both these questions and thinking about how they can leverage the skills that you've developed through these interests when thinking about working. We are generously funded by the University of California Humanities Research Institute. Last year, we hosted panels on book publishing, how to write an op-ed, the digital humanities. We hosted the Cal STS retreat this summer, which I see many of you attended after the team at UC Davis very kindly let us take up the mantle for a year. And in the coming year, we have a series of panels on kind of scholarship and activism. Next month, we'll be having a panel on how to apply your research to podcast development. So we have some really exciting events coming up. Feel free to contact us at www.stsfuturesinitiative.org or at our Gmail, which Baker will pop in the chat. And if you want to be added to our mailing list to learn about future events, etc. So we are joined today by Baker, another team member at UC Santa Barbara, and Kat Gutierrez, who is joining us from New York and is an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz. So in the chat, we've got our Twitter, website, email, etc. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists who have generously joined us today. First, we have Dr. Rodrigo Ochigame, who's an assistant professor in the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Their research examines unorthodox models of computational rationality, such as non-classical logics from Brazil, non-binary Turing machines from India, and frameworks of information science from Cuba. Their teaching specialties include digital anthropology, the anthropology of science and technology, and the social dimensions of robotics and artificial intelligence. Ochigame received a BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So welcome, Professor Ochigame. Next, we have Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony, who is a historian and the curator of the Apollo collection at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Her research focuses on the political history of exploring the moon, from debates about lunar governance to the use of spaceflight as soft power. The topic of her most recent book, Operation Moonglow, is a political history of Project Apollo through, I'm sorry, not the 50 objects, excuse me. Yes, her most recent book is Operation Moonglow, a political history of Project Apollo. And finally, Professor Ranjodh Singh Dhaliwal researches and teaches about the aesthetic and politico-economic entanglements of our technological cultures. He holds the Ruth and Paul Idzik Assistant Professorship in Digital Scholarship in English at the University of Notre Dame, where he is also affiliated with the Lucy Family Institute of Data and Society and the program in History and Philosophy of Science. So yes, thank you so much for joining us. And the way that we're going to set this up today is have each of our panelists just have a brief kind of informal presentation about the parts of their experience, both as a graduate student in the final years of their PhD career and kind of on the job market. They'll share their experiences with you, and then we'll move into a Q&A version. I've prepared a number of questions, but Baker will be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, just pop them in there and they'll go into a Google Doc. And when we have time at the end, we will get to your questions if we can. So first, we'll hear from Dr. Ochigame, who will talk about some of the considerations that they've faced when making the decision to live and work in the Netherlands instead of the US, where they went to graduate school at MIT. Including universities' labor practices, financial structures, and modes of dependence on military, corporate, and philanthropic sponsorship, and what that means for people looking for a job here in the US. So Professor Ochigame, take it away.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this, and thank you for having me. I thought that I would, that I would just start by talking a little bit about some of the considerations that I faced in deciding to leave the U.S. academic system for the Dutch one. Some basic info about my background that conditioned those decisions is that one is that I grew up in Brazil, and most of my family most of my family is in Brazil, and I don't have any family in the United States. So and the Brazilian academic system at the moment was just not an option, right? For many reasons. I think if the Brazilian academic system had been a little bit more akin to what it was like when I was growing up under Workers' Party rule, it would have been a different situation. But to be an academic in the humanities and social sciences in Brazil at the moment is very difficult, not just because of funding cuts, but also because of political surveillance and repression in public universities under the Bolsonaro regime. So I basically found myself in the position of an economic migrant, choosing between different higher education systems, largely on the basis of their labor conditions for what I wanted to do, and I think it would have been very helpful for me to have gotten a kind of honest assessment of what was and was not different between these different university systems. So I guess I'll try to give you what my impression is after having made this transition and been here for about a semester. So some things are not different. Okay, so what are the things that are not different? One is that the academic labor market in Europe is also extremely scarce, and in general, labor conditions in higher education are worse than in other sectors for equivalent amounts of formal training and experience. Okay, so I think that's similar. Another thing that's similar is that universities here are predominantly dependent on adjunct labor, okay, and increasingly so. So most people have contingent employment in the form of temporary contracts, and tenure track positions and permanent contracts are increasingly rare. So that's similar. And another thing that's similar is that junior faculty are also under pressure to attract outside funding. And a certain neoliberal conception of the professor as an entrepreneurial subject is also very pervasive here. And university administrations use very explicit language, like you buy out of teaching, for example. Okay, so that's a kind of language that pervades both the US and European systems. But some things are considerably different, and I think those differences were enough to motivate my move. So I'll talk a little bit about what I think is actually different. I think one major difference is that there's a lesser degree of inequality of wages between different kinds of workers in the university. So if you compare the lowest wages to the highest in US universities, between, say, like the cooking and cleaning staff and the top administrators and football coaches, the difference is in the order of hundreds of times. Okay? It's a very dramatic kind of inequality. Whereas in public universities in Europe, I think that the difference is smaller by about an order of magnitude. I think the difference between the lowest and the highest wages in the university is still within the order of magnitude of 10 or less. Okay? So I think that's one major difference. Another major difference is that labor rights are much stronger here, and organized labor is much stronger here. So in the Netherlands, every year, trade unions reach an agreement with the Association of Universities on a collective labor agreement. And one of the consequences of that is that there is a greater equality of wages between different universities and between the different fields. So just to give an example, when my wage was being determined, the procedure was that an independent department in the university would assess an anonymized CV And on the basis of the years of experience and training you have, they would place you on a salary scale. So that's how it's supposed to work. I've heard reports that in practice, that, there's still some individual level negotiation that happens, and there's some room for negotiation. But at least the basic system is one that's supposed to guarantee a certain kind of equality of wages between fields and between different universities. And the third major difference, and I think that's that was particularly big for me, was that the funding sources in the universities are different. So in the US, at MIT, for example, if you're in the STS field, the dominant funding source for humanities and social science departments, and including STS departments, is tuition fees. Teaching activities. Universities hate to admit this. The administration hates to admit this, but teaching activities operate at a surplus, and very often a very large surplus. So what funds humanities and social sciences departments is very often, in effect, student debt, right? Whereas it's a little bit less the case in the public university system here, in which tuition fees are lower by an order of magnitude. I mean, they're still high. They're still high for many people, and that creates many barriers to higher education, but not nearly in the scale of the US system. Even though in the US system, the teaching activities generate a surplus, I mean, junior faculty in the departments that generate profits through teaching are also under the pressure to attract outside funding. But the sources available are, largely either military, corporate, or philanthropic, right? In varying degrees. I think in MIT as a whole, about half of sponsored research comes from military sources, and a smaller amount than that comes from corporate sources. Whereas in the European system, or at least where I am, the dominant funding sources are still government sources. So there would be the Dutch equivalent of the NSF, which is called the NWO, or the European Research Council. And I thought that for the kind of work I wanted to do, I would be more likely to be able to do it in a way that's relatively, that is less compromised than if I were under the funding pressures in the US system. So so I guess these were some of the considerations I had, and I guess that's enough for initial remarks.
Great, thank you so much. And again, just a reminder for anyone who's come in, if you have questions as this is unfolding, feel free to pop them in the chat, and Baker will take note of them. So thank you so much, Professor Ochigame. Next, Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony will talk about her experience as curator at the Smithsonian and the ways in which she's been able to apply her research and skills to her work at the National Air and Space Museum, but also on executive councils of both the Society for the History of Technology and the History Committee of the American Astronautical Society, as well as a number of more public-facing projects. So Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony is going to talk about that for a bit.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. Hello, everyone. So I'll talk a bit about being a curator, because I think that role is not all that well understood or probably spoken about in graduate school. At least it wasn't in my experience way back when. And then I'll also tell you some of my ideas about the ways that we talk about different types of job opportunities in the field of STS. And I think I ended up actually graduating from the same program as Rodrigo, the Haas program. Yeah, okay. I'm a few years ahead of you, I think. You came after me, but and when I was in graduate school, I had an interest in museums. I actually, after undergraduate, got an internship at the Air and Space Museum because of my love of history of astronomy, realized that this might be a career I'd want. And then so ended up first going to the HPS program at Notre Dame, which our next speaker I think is from, and then on to MIT. And throughout that time, I maintained this interest in museums, and that was extremely helpful for understanding what life outside of a university might be like. And I recall when shortly after I found out I was offered the job at the Smithsonian, I recall a friend saying, how do you feel about leaving academia? As if I was going to completely sort of leave my training, leave my experience as a historian, say goodbye to basically all the people that I had gotten to know over all the years. And fortunately, I knew museums, and I knew that this wasn't really going to be my experience sort of as she presented it. And so I think it's really important for us to start, not just talk about, use new language in terms of academic careers or alt-ac, but really recognize the diversity within each of those paths, or that there are many, many paths, so that the positions at universities are extremely diverse. So sometimes we talk about how you can go into museums, or you can go into government, or you can go into nonprofits, or you can be a part of a university. And I think that flattens things too much. It chromes plates so a lot of the positions at universities, and we so often use the language of quitting academia, and it's so problematic because being an adjunct professor is a very different thing than being a tenure track professor, or being a professor when you have a very light teaching load is very different than a 4-4 load. So I'll just quickly say, I think that's really problematic. And I think it's important to understand sort of the opportunities in all different types of positions. And when I was a graduate student, and Rodrigo, I don't know if it was like this for you in the program, but we primarily focused on sort of developing our analytical skills, and we focused on research and writing, presenting our work at conferences, but we spent very little time training how to be professors, how to teach. That really wasn't what our training was in. And so I felt that when I left graduate school, my strongest skills weren't necessarily in the classroom, even though I do love teaching. So anyway, I'll just say a quick sort of some details about what I do on a day-to-day basis at the Smithsonian. When I was in graduate school, I did have some concerns that my work, all this research I was doing, was going to have an extremely small audience, and that's okay. But I did want to have an impact, and so I spent a lot of time thinking about, how someone can have an impact. And a place like a museum offers opportunity for that. So at the National Air and Space Museum, we have about 8 million people come through a year. It's one of the most visited museums in the world, and you don't engage with everyone at the same level, but it is an extraordinarily diverse group of people. It's a free museum, which helps in that diversity. And so that appealed to me. And curators at the Smithsonian, a huge component of the work is research and writing. That's actually the primary criteria we get promoted on. We have a sort of a tenure review system for promotion, and 50% of that is research and writing, and then our collections and exhibition work amounts for the rest. And so that is a big component of a job at that institution. And then I also work on exhibits. I'm working on 3 different exhibits right now: lunar exploration, globalization, and climate change. And then I oversee the Apollo collection at the museum. And so that involves sort of working with conservators who are taking care of artifacts, dealing with artifact loans, dealing with questions, stuff like that. And then I also have the opportunity to do sort of a lot of public engagement, and as well as giving talks at conferences and keeping up my sort of normal, more academic work. I have the ability to write for a variety of audiences, so I'm expected to publish in peer-reviewed journals, but I'm also encouraged to publish for the general audience as well. And so my first book, actually, I did with National Geographic, and it has a lot of pictures, and it was a fun project. So telling the history of the Apollo program through artifacts at the museum. And I thought it'd be a really good way to bring some of the insights from STS to the general public and make it a more sort of digestible, accessible way to access a lot of the incredible research that's being done that isn't necessarily read by the broader public. I ended up doing a TV series based on that book, working with the Smithsonian Channel. So a 6-part series, which was a lot of fun to work on. I can go into more detail with that. And then we created a augmented reality app that was associated with that as well. And then I also have the opportunity to teach. So I teach at Georgetown. I do a class a year, and I also work with, there's a space group there that I work with and I advise students. And then I'm very interested in policy. And so I've started this, or I took over this Space Policy and History Forum in Washington, D.C., which brings together historians of spaceflight and space policy analysts sort of as a community, and finds a way to connect those through events. And so that's one of the things that I get to do in my role as a curator as well. So I could go on and on, but we have a lot to cover today. I'll just add 2 sort of suggestions for graduate students thinking about their future. I'd highly recommend, if you're early in graduate school, get internships or fellowships in institutions that are not universities and colleges, and see what it's like, get a sense if that's for you or not. But that's a great way to have a better understanding of sort of the diversity of different types of positions out there. And then also go to conferences and meet the people who are not professors and ask them what their job is like, how much time they spend researching, if that's really important to you, or have them explain what they do, because these are people who are still very engaged with the community. They're still part of our community, and but their job experiences are slightly different. And I think understanding them will help you have a better sense of what your options are, and make it seem less like there are 2 options and you're either in or you're out. You either stay in academia or you leave it. And it's a much more complex sort of landscape than that. And your choices are much sort of more diverse and nuanced than it often seems, in the way, especially that we talk about it within the university.
Great, thank you so much for that. And finally, we will have Professor Dhaliwal, who will be discussing his experience with applying for jobs as a necessarily interdisciplinary candidate, and what STS can mean to different audiences, among other things. So, Professor Dhaliwal.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I want to start by talking about the kind of genre of advice, which I have, at least job market advice, which I have a very conflicted relationship with. I think it's important to kind of, sort of, for me to, any remarks that I make now or later throughout, be taken with a kind of pinch of salt, because of questions of survivor bias, but also questions of like the fact that there are structural problems to which advice is only either a placebo or an acceleration, but not necessarily a resolution. So with that being said, I'm going to primarily be talking initially about positioning oneself as an STS scholar and what that means and looks like. I think I have 4 pieces of quote unquote advice there. First is to be aware of what STS is for others. I think it's incredibly important, especially for a discipline / meta discipline like STS that exists in like n number of departments, but not really in, as a department, you wouldn't find those many STS departments. You find a few here and there that have their very clear identities, but people work on science and technology in all kinds of departments that do not look like STS at all. And I think it's important to ask yourself if your understanding of what STS is and isn't has been delimited or shaped by the department that you were in or the people that you were advised by, and so on and so forth. And try to ask yourself, what would a third person who never was trained in STS but knows the intellectual field in universities look at STS and say, right? Like, so what would a random random sociologist or philosopher who has never done any work on STS think about STS as a discipline. I think there are some easy ways to do that. I mean, one of the ways is just like being aware of the range of things that happen, say at 4S or SHOT or HSS or whatever your conferences or STS adjacent conferences are. And you'll occasionally often find like surprising things that STS scholars do, or surprising kinds of departments that they themselves find in. I mean, I think I'm a good example of how many times I've gotten questions of like, what are you doing in STS? Only for people to then realize that literature and science is like a 40-year-old field, if not more, that has its own associations and own sort of genealogies and trajectories and intellectual forays that do not always stand at the front of what happens at 4S, but is STS through and through nevertheless. So first is be aware for STS, what STS is for others, and don't let the department that you are in shape your conception of what STS is or isn't. Second is to think about affinities rather than divisions. I think one of the things that we are trained to do as grad students is really like carve out your spaces or think about what happens that is distinct in your department and among your advisors, distinct from what happens everywhere else in scholarship. And I think it's useful to, especially as a job candidate, start thinking in terms of what are the similarities of what happens elsewhere instead of what are the differences. You know, I mean, as a general thumb rule, a certain kind of job in the academia, in the humanities and social sciences academia in the US at the very least, is shrinking. And I think it's useful to acknowledge that there are certain models of like, you know, what we call like the deficit model of scholarship that may not necessarily be the only way that we can write and pitch ourselves. And so I know I generally think of it as saying, instead of being like, I do STSE work in, say, anthropology, trying to think of yourself as an STS scholar and an anthropologist, and what does that look like together, instead of being one flavor of something, being two things, and how would that change your point of view in how you write and how you talk to other scholars from other disciplines. Number three is thinking about kind of audience beyond STS, precisely because so many people work and think about science and technology and may not themselves, you know, be aware of discourse in STS. Thinking about how exactly you can pitch what is it that you're doing to people who are not just invested in STS, but elsewhere. This is something that you will be anyway doing for a part of the job applications, where you talk about yourself and having a book project that not only speaks to questions in the discipline, but elsewhere. It's just helpful to be a little more conscious about it from a discipline perspective and ask yourself, okay, what does my scholarship contribute to a layperson who is interested in questions of science and technology, and have a pitch that sort of focuses that rather than just saying, here's the aftermath of, I don't know, actor network theory, and here's how I intervene methodologically and this and that. And my fourth point is there will be people always, both on search committees and in departments and elsewhere in the university, who want, in some ways, a way to be able to pitch you or root for you or identify you even in their own notes, for example. So I think it's useful to have in your own head, be very clear about what your identifiable kind of methodological or thematic identity is, right? So I think it's very useful for colleagues to be able to, or potential colleagues to be able to point out, oh yes, we are hiring someone who, you know, does historical work on the cultural construction of technology, or something of that sort. Like they you know, something that's kind of pigeonholing in some ways, but in a way that is then identifiable to someone in the college that does a completely different kind of work, right? Like that has otherwise no access to this, but is easily able to know what is it that you do and you don't. I can talk more about this later, but there are multiple kinds of job searches and multiple kinds of things happening when job searches happen. And so be ready to kind of be a little more agile with what is it that a random colleague in the department might identify you as versus what is it that a random person in a completely different discipline might identify you as, and how is it that you're helping them do that kind of identificatory pitch. People really like it when they know that they have a grasp on what is it that you're doing, even if it's a limited grasp. So think about that difference. You're being hired in one level by like a committee in a department, sometimes by multiple departments, but at another level, the paperwork also will go through like deans and provosts. And so there are multiple people in the stage who need to be able to identify you. And I think thinking about that a little more consciously is useful. I'm going to stop there, but we can talk more.
Thank you so much. That's immensely helpful. So we're now going to move into the question and answer portion. I'm just going to ask questions, some of them very direct and pointed, others kind of open-ended. Anyone who wants to jump in, please do. And again, for people who have joined us just now, feel free to pose any questions that you have in the chat and we'll get to them. We'll try as best we can to get to them. So over the last couple weeks in the invitations that we've been sending out for this panel, and also over the summer when we were doing the Cal STS retreat, we asked, we had a Google form and asked students to list, if you could ask any set of questions to a number of recent PhDs, what would they be? And a lot of them did touch upon these institutional, philosophical, political questions about the professional world. A lot of them were also very, very practical, which makes a lot of sense because often in these graduate programs, it's not exactly laid out how to approach the job market. A cohort will just kind of disappear on the job search with a big J and a big S, and then they leave. So my first question is pretty open-ended. When would you say that you began seriously preparing yourself for the job search, whatever that means to you? And how did you go about doing it? This could be thinking about how you were putting together your CV, whether it was working on something to publish so that you could pitch that to a department that you're applying to or otherwise, or just opening your imagination to what a job in STS can be. Like, when did you start? Can you pinpoint a moment in your graduate career, or do you have advice for students who are like, when do I need to get started thinking about this?
I can jump in. I'm not a great example because I don't think I really thought about it early enough. It worked out okay for me, but there's, a lot of luck involved in everything that happens in life. And, people were retiring at the right time for me to get the job that I wanted. But I would say start thinking about the job market as soon as you're in graduate school, if not before, if you haven't already, and make a lot of decisions throughout your graduate school process that allows you to be really well prepared. So that's, trying to get publications, but that's also exposing yourself to different types of jobs. Meeting people at conferences is a great way to get additional opportunities, better understanding of what's possible, get engaged with other types of projects outside your university. So there are different ways that you probably should think about the job market or have it sort of a part of your life, depending on where you are in graduate school. But I think it's important to keep aware of it from the very start and prepare yourself and be as prepared as possible in a number of different dimensions, so that when you get to the point of applying, you have a better sense of, how you see yourself, how you identify yourself, which is what we just heard about. And then also what types of positions might work for you, and how to do it. And then also that your application is as strong as it could possibly be.
One thing I think I can add to that is earlier the better, but for me, and this might not be a typical process because I think people have different kinds of relationships with their work and the academy as they move around in their grad career. But for me, I remember there was a clear moment when I had never applied for jobs before, or because I was reaching a certain year or something, or even because I had enough number of chapters done or anything of that sort. I think the moment I really started thinking hard about like applying for jobs was when in my brain, like the confidence level went from being like, oh, I have like so much insecurity, to being like, actually, I've been reading a lot of like recent work that's coming out, and I'm also writing recent work, and it's getting received well. And I, as like a reader, how much ever I maybe kind of, I have affinity to my work, I still should be able to figure out when I'm writing something that's bad. And there came a moment when I was like, okay, no, this isn't right. Like I'm reading writing by like other assistant professors, other associate professors. I think I'm ready. Like I'm ready as a scholar. And I know that's not always easy because of all these structural things that the academy makes us do and kind of belittles us in all these ways as grad students. But if you are someone who has, or who can be slightly, careful with one's own work, I think there'll be a point of time when you will look at what you are doing and what others are doing and know that you are ready for some other level, right? Like, or that you have kind of outgrown what is it that you do. That would be, I think, like a good time to like start thinking about preparing the documents, but start thinking about it, as Teasel said, like the earlier the better, or whenever you have the brain space for it, if you want to have the brain space for it.
Well, in my case, I went back and forth on the question of whether I wanted to apply for jobs in higher education in the first place, quite a lot. To the extent that I think, at some point during my second year, I thought that I would do it, and at some point in my third year, I thought that I would not. I think for me, like preparing for the process of a job search really began intensely around the end of the fourth year of graduate school. And that was prompted by a kind of impending end of guaranteed funding. Because I thought that I wouldn't have guaranteed funding after the fifth year of the program, I might have to look for different sources, or to teach at a more frequent rate. I thought that I would start looking, and one thing that I thought that would happen at that point was that I thought that I could just reserve one day a week to the process of preparing the materials and submitting them. And I think on the whole, I think that in the beginning it took a lot of time to prepare them and to get as much feedback as possible and to craft the cover letters and all that. I think after a certain point, most of the work is tailoring to different posts. So it does take less time of like actual work. So in principle, you could reserve a little bit of time each week to do it, and continue doing other things in the rest of the week. That's what my initial plan was, but the actual experience was quite different from that. I think as soon as I started submitting things around the end of the fourth year, the process of the job search really took a lot of mental and emotional space. Like in the period leading up to accepting a position. So.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like the job search, however long it takes, is a really exhausting experience for a lot of people. And like you said, Professor Ochigame, a lot of people go back and forth wondering, is academia for me? Are there other options, et cetera? One question that came up a bunch is, I guess this is more geared toward you and Professor Dhaliwal. How did you decide academia was right for you? Did you look in other sectors? Were those options available to you? Did you apply for any other jobs? When did you know that academia was where you were going to focus your job search? or not when, but when did you decide, how did you decide that academia was right for you?
I think I can go first. I actually didn't. And I think in some ways for me, the question was that, yeah, I'm prepared for this. I've been trained for this. I'm perfectly okay-ish at my work. And there was a moment of time when, as I said, there was this move where in my own head, I knew that, if something in academia doesn't work out for me and my life personally, then it was not going to be because of any deficiency on my part. It's just because of how things are as they are. So I actually never took that as my primary sort of like, I guess, life goal in any way. I had a plan B, C, and D, and those were very far away from academia. And that's because, like, just as a human, you have multiple interests and things that go around, and life situations. Like, I had a partner who was in a different continent, and for the longest time, it felt like this wasn't actually the primary thing that I was aiming towards. I was lucky enough that it worked out. And I was more than happy to continue if the conditions were good enough. But I think in some ways, like, detaching myself from whether this was the thing that I have decided to do or not was actually perhaps a little useful, because I was a little, each rejection hurt a little less. Each of those, like, sort of running the wheels turned a little more smoothly, because I knew I was just going through the motions with one of my options in life, knowing very well that I'm also thinking about and actively preparing for, like, completely different kinds of life choices. Like, my second option was actually to go into coffee roasting, which is nothing to do with academia at all, but there was, like, something that I was interested in, and I thought I could actually make a career out of. And I had a set plan for if this didn't work out or something. And so I never did. I never actually decided that academia was right for me. I think because that decision is mutual. So I left it for the academia to decide whether I was good for it.
I love that. That's great.
Yes. So, in my case, as I've mentioned, and I think there was a lot of my going back and forth was the politics of there were many protests going on at MIT around the time that I was a graduate student. I think for me, I decided to try to apply for some higher ed employment, because I do enjoy what the work is supposed to entail. And that's the first thing I tried. I didn't really seek employment outside of higher education, broadly construed. Some other options I considered. One of them was to do work on the ethical and political dimensions of computing in institutions, academic or otherwise, that were closer to public policy work. And I think that because of because I had the unusual experience of having some exposure to high-level deliberations about funding related to those public policy related spaces when I was a student, I decided that was not for me. That the kind of work I wanted to do would be very difficult to do in a sufficiently uncompromised way in organizations closer to public policy. And then the other option was to be a computer programmer of some sort. And to make a wage doing something like that, rather than being in higher education. But I didn't see employment in any of those places. I just, I tried higher education first, and that, and that just turned out to work. Yeah. Great.
Thank you so much.
Can I add an answer to that? Even though I did not choose to be a professor, I didn't choose not to be either. So it was just sort of happenstance that the position that I'm in came up before the sort of season of the job market. And so I applied to it. I thought it would be a great fit. I had a familiarity with it, but sometimes you don't necessarily have to choose against something or decide you're leaving something, or it doesn't have to be that stark, and that you can actually just see what's out there. What are the jobs available when you need a job? And I was a postdoc at that time, and it was a nice long postdoc, 3-year postdoc. So I had time, and my job came up in the middle of that. So I just went for it. So I never really went on the job market. But I was expecting that I was going to. I hadn't rejected that as an idea. So you don't have to be fully committed to one career path, go for it, and then have your option B, C. You can just apply for jobs that come up that sound interesting, and decide whether or not you want to pursue them.
Yeah, thank you so much for that point. We've talked a bit about how this AC distinction that's kind of come to dominate the language of professional development isn't always that useful, especially when you're thinking about where you might want to work after your graduate degree. So one more really, I guess, practical question that idea definitely applies to is, so were there any resources that you found especially useful when you were kind of Dr. Muir-Harmony? Oh my gosh. All right, look at me reflecting exactly what we're trying to break down. Dr. Muir-Harmony, in your case, when you wanted to kind of open your horizons, or for Professor Ochigame and Dhaliwal, were there any specific resources that you found especially useful in that process, whether it was a particular event that you went to, or an online database, or Twitter, for example? As someone who's in a history department, the things that come to mind as to like when I start looking for a job are HNet, the American Historical Association page, listservs. Was there a specific resource like that you found useful? I'm also a little bit afraid of the answer. Twitter just seems existentially exhausting, and I'm hoping that that's not necessary.
I'll add, for if you're interested in government positions, so that can be federally funded museums, or it can be, you could be a historian at NASA, for instance, sort of space focused, but or NSF or other places. USA Jobs is a good place for that. So I think it's usajobs.gov, and you can sign up on a mailing list, and they'll send you notifications of jobs that sort of fit the criteria you're interested in. And then also, use conferences as a great opportunity. Special interest groups often have, I'm very involved in SHOT, and the special interest groups often have mailing lists where they circulate information. So in addition to HNet and those types of resources, just being really part of a community and getting to know more and more people through conferences, reaching outside of your university is a great way, because then people will forward you job advertisements if they think that it fits, your interest in what you're doing.
Well, I mainly learned of job opportunities through the conventional job boards. I also signed up to several mailing lists, some of which I don't remember the names, and I'm not on Twitter, in part because it's just not for me. But I'm very glad that I have a lot of friends who are, and who would keep track of job postings and would send me generously. They would just send me the links. So a lot of the quite a few of the jobs that I applied for were not jobs that I found myself, were jobs that somebody else found and sent to me directly, including the one that I did end up getting.
I should also point out that there are So for jobs outside of the US, the job boards and job postings look very different, especially in Europe. It's a complete mess. And there's like each country sometimes has its like own webpage that everyone goes to. There's the European Union job board of some kind, and there's like all these other extraneous things that you have to keep on looking out for. And I just had like, I don't know how many ever tabs open all the time that I would refresh. And so in the US, sure, like, you know, like HNet and Twitter and like your friends could like let you know if things are happening. And but outside of the US, things start getting a little less cohesive. I mean, there's some cases, for example, I think sometimes Canadian universities do not advertise jobs at all. Sometimes some European universities just have the jobs on like their university's job page. And the hope is that one day some people will find it. So you'll have to kind of, it's unusual and weird, but just know very well that jobs from other geographical regions are not going to fall in your lap in quite the same way as kind of standardized, say, HNet or MLA job boards or whatever have you in the US.
Great. Thank you all so much for that. So now moving on to kind of your experience with the current positions that you're in and the work that you've been doing. In preparing these questions, one thing that really struck me was how interdisciplinary and collaborative the work that you're all doing is in different ways. Like, for example, Professor Dhaliwal, this is a bit of a preamble, but it's striking. Among other projects, you've written an essay on the experimental interface between real-life sports and its video gamic simulation, a short piece on the division of labor in informatics of domination, and are working on a piece on the saved game state, and another that looks at memes, TikToks, and other new media to study cringe as an aesthetic category. And you've also co-authored a piece or co-authoring a piece on the co-construction of media ecologies of research and the paradigms of neural networks. All of those subjects seem to me inherently interdisciplinary, and you're working in a department of English. How do you approach that kind of interdisciplinary work, whether it's the people that you're working with or the institutions or people outside of academia? How do you approach that interdisciplinary collaborative work that you're doing?
So I think there are kind of two answers to it. One is an answer of kind of how this comes to be, and the other answer is how it operates on a day-to-day level. So I'll answer the first one. I mean, I was trained as a computer scientist and engineer in my undergrad, tried to work in the industry, did not like it, largely for similar ethical and sort of global political reasons that Rodrigo has outlined. And then I wanted to move and see what I would rather study and learn. And that was, you know, kind of dipping my toes into humanities and social sciences. And to be really honest, I could not decide. I mean, you know, I was reading and really loving multiple disciplines all at the same time. And so the reason that I even chose English and STS together at Davis, where I did my grad work, was precisely because I could not decide, and because I was interested in all of these things. And because historically, actually, English has been one of those big disciplines in each college that actually is just like wide and vast and has spawned multiple other disciplines in history. I mean, film studies, cultural studies, American studies, many of which come from English in the kind of educational history of the US at the very least. And so I think it was many of those things essentially kind of come by osmosis. My committee was like, I think, employed in like 6 departments, like the 3 of them were employed in 6 departments. And like, that was the stuff that I was reading. Those were the people that I was meeting and collaborating with. So it was never the case that like, these things could be thought of as singularly in my head, just because I was never like brought up in those kind of academic environments. So I think that's the kind of reason for like what this looks like on the page, just because like those are the, you know, people that I've hung out with, and those are my friends and advisors and so on and so forth. I think the other part is what it looks like on a day-to-day operation. And what it looks like is essentially kind of the ability to put on multiple hats. I think I love the kind of primary question that anthropologists often have, which is like, what does this audience care about? Like not what they study, but like what they care about, which I think is really useful for putting on those multiple hats. Because if you are, say, you know, I mean, I go to SHOT and I go to 4S, but I also go to like conferences in English and media studies. It's important to like be able to see where the other people are coming from. And so I think interdisciplinarity in that way can only be spawned if you acknowledge other people's positions and interests in the same thing that you're looking at, rather than try to earmark the difference in what your approach is, what others' approach is. In many cases, I mean, sometimes there are just like clear, stark, distinctive visions that you cannot get across. For me, those are, again, usually questions of politics. But most other kinds of things you can like work around and be like, okay, what are these other people interested in? And how do we interface? And what would it take for me to start thinking that way, or acknowledging that these people are thinking that way? So I would just say, be kind to others and to yourself, and be stupid, and be acknowledged that like there are things that you don't know that like might have clear answers in other subdisciplines that you just haven't ever had the chance to read. Like I never read like sociology of science, like up until my STS 200 course. And that seemed really weird. Like, why are you making these arguments in the following way? But once I started reading it, I had to be like, okay, that makes sense. I can see where you're coming from, even if I don't want to go there.
Dr. Muir-Harmony, I could pass that question to you as well, because sorry, if I could just go back up here. I know we've had a couple questions. For example, you continue to teach, attend conferences, you serve on executive committees of scholarly societies, but then also, as you said before, you're participating in media interviews. You had a TV show that you were working on. You do a lot of public-facing work. And while I could ask you, like, how do you bridge those two worlds? I think we've kind of gotten to the heart of the idea that talking about two worlds that need to be bridged isn't always the best approach. So I guess the way I will frame the question is, in what ways have you continued to engage with the relationships and scholarship, et cetera, that you cultivated in graduate school in your current work? And maybe more than make that work public facing, maybe pull these people and ideas into a more public sphere.
There are lots of different ways I could answer that. I will say that with my position, so I sort of see it as, instead of having time in the classroom, I work on exhibits. And so that there's still this time for going to conferences. It's expected that I go to conferences and that I engage with the history of science, technology, STS community in the same ways that I would in a different institution. And that, I should mention, it might also be, it's not necessarily the same in all curatorial positions, and the Smithsonian really sort of values that a lot. So I can't speak to everything, but I found it really exciting to think about communicating concepts in STS and a lot of the research that I've done and others have done to a broader audience. And I think it's not a huge challenge. I mean, people are interested in interesting stories. And so making this material as accessible as possible. So sometimes it means leaving out some of the jargon, but it doesn't necessarily mean saying something different. And I think that when I was a graduate student, that wasn't completely clear to me. And the ways that we talk about, we tend to make our discipline very insular, and we do that in a number of different ways. So we do that in the ways that we talk about jobs. We do that in the language that we use. And so you sort of have to be, part of the club. You have to learn the language. You have to, go to the conferences and things like that. But a lot of the ideas that we're talking about, the discoveries that we make in our research are things that can be understood and appreciated by people outside of our discipline. And I think it's of great value and to the general health of the discipline to figure out how to do that. I mean, I think if we want to be relevant, if we want people to think that there's a public good, sort of a civic and societal good in the work we do, we have to figure out how to engage with, communicate, make our work speak to people outside of our discipline. And so I found it extremely exciting and sort of enlivening to spend time doing that. And so my first book was a great, I needed a little break for my dissertation project, and the Apollo anniversary was coming up. We were 50th anniversary of the moon landing. So I decided to do this artifact book, and it was a ton of fun. And it allowed me to also read within space history and some of the insights. So there's like some really great work done on checklists. So I was able to draw on that and write a short essay that was hopefully accessible to a general audience. But then I was also able to then, revise my dissertation and work on that and then publish that as well. And so I have the luxury that in my position, I have the time to do all these different types of projects, and all these different types of projects are valued. And that's one thing to take into consideration as you consider the types of jobs you apply for is, if you're interested in documentaries, for instance, not all positions will think that that's a positive use of your time. Or if you want to publish in, newspapers or other types of popular publications, not all positions will think that's positive. And so it's just important to think through what you want to do, the impact you want to have, the conversations you want to have. But there are some opportunities to be in positions where you can engage with multiple communities. And I think with our STS training, it's sort of a natural fit. Like we all are sort of interdisciplinary by training, and I think we appreciate that. And so there are lots of different ways that you can sort of take that forward in the different positions that you might pursue.
Thank you so much. That makes me think of when I was reading up on Professor Ochigame, there was this really fantastic quote in this profile that MIT News did. I'll put that in the chat. For Ochigame, keeping a broad perspective should be not only a personal endeavor, but also a community and institutional one. And with regard to interdisciplinary collaborative work, Professor Ochigame, you've put together searchatlas.org together with, I'm sorry, I have the name here. I'm scrolling up and down. With Catherine Ye, a computer scientist, which is kind of an alternative search engine that lets you search across different languages and regions. Do you have anything that you'd like to share about your interdisciplinary collaborative work that you've done either on this search engine or otherwise?
Okay. So I would say that working on a project like Search Atlas with somebody like Catherine was not particularly challenging because Catherine is someone who actually, despite being based in a computer science department, is somebody who's very much interested in STS and reads quite a lot of STS on their own time. So I would say that project is one that was very closely related to some of the lines of work that I was doing in my STS program that were more easily legible to the people who to the people in the program as the sort of work that they did. So one example of that is that at the same time I was working on the history of information science in Cuba, right? So a lot of questions about the politics of indexing and searching were very much on my mind, and simultaneously I was interested in doing these experimental projects and designing software, Catherine was just a very easy collaborator for someone in STS to work with, just because of yeah, I mean, their own interest in what STS has to offer. Yeah, you know, one thing I would say as it relates to jobs is that I mean, doing that sort of work was not particularly encouraged for you know, in the kind of PhD program where I was in. I mean, it was not discouraged either, but it was just. But I think I was under some. I mean, at points I felt some pressure to have a more clearly defined disciplinary identity, right? Yeah, I mean, I had an anthropologist as my main advisor, but on my committee I had a historian, I had a philosopher. I was working on these projects with computer scientists, and for the most part, it was just trying to follow my curiosities. And you know, at the times where I felt a certain degree of pressure because people would warn me about the labor market and such, I think my excuse to myself was, I mean, you don't go into something like anthropology for the money, right? So, you know, I mean, the labor market was just so extremely scarce that was my excuse to not making compromises on the kinds of curiosities and the kinds of work I had. I mean, for the sake of jobs that may not even exist, right? Yeah, so I think that, yeah, that was a situation I found myself in when I was doing that.
Professor Ochigame, there's actually a question that's directly relevant to that in the chat. Somebody else who is also looking for the process of looking at jobs outside of the market in their home country is asking, what is your process of moving to Europe? You know, what was that like? How were the applications received? And as PhD students here in the States or in a country that isn't your own, how can we be better prepared for STS-related non-US or European academic positions?
Okay, so one thing to note about that is that, as Ranjodh was saying, you have to actively look for jobs in Europe and actively search for them because they often don't make it to the ordinary job boards. So I mean, in the case of the job that I applied for here in the Netherlands, I mean, it was my partner who found it by, you know, like searching in European job boards, and I, you know, and that particular post never made it into my listing. So the first thing is to actively search, and another thing to note is that I think that in a lot of places inside of the EU system, the university labor market, the higher ed labor markets, so I mean, in a sense, that's somewhat akin to the US, right? The US higher ed labor market discriminates very heavily against people who don't have PhDs from US institutions. So that's just so that's similar in many parts of that's similar in many parts of Europe. Although I think there are certain there are just certain places that will more readily recognize credentials from, say, the US. So I think the Netherlands is one of those systems. Denmark is another one. And I think that the Danish system will recognize US PhDs. But I think in much of the EU that's not the case. So I think it's worth taking a look. It's worth taking a look into these kinds of politics so that you just don't waste your time. Right? Yeah.
And Professor Ochigame, I don't want to exhaust you with one more question, but I think it's very relevant to both of the points that you've made here. So with regard to your move to the Netherlands, and also what you were talking about, not wanting to compromise your interests, your politics, in that, sorry, dog just walked up. In that MIT profile on you in your last year of your graduate program, you really reflected this "many things can be true at once" idea. You went into your what seemed like a wonderful experience at MIT with your advisor, with the atmosphere there. But you also were really frank and direct about your qualms with the Institute's dependence on corporate and military funding. With the current system of tenure here that we have in the US, a lot of early career scholars, not to mention graduate students, would be really hesitant to have that kind of frank discussion. I'm going to put these in the chat as well, but you've written some articles for Logic and the New Left Review that get into what Dr. Sophia Noble has termed algorithms of oppression, and also the radical projects that are working to dismantle them, which personally I admire your work very much. So I guess my question is, when you're taking such a deliberate and frankly anti-capitalist approach to your work and your research, has your honest interrogation of these systems shaped your experience, whether as a grad student, as a professional, as someone on the job market, whether that's limiting opportunities, opening new ones up? How has that impacted you? Because I know it's a fear of some students who do want to be more deliberate and frank in their work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very difficult out there. I think that the stance that I decided to take for myself, but which is enabled by certain forms of privilege and protection, for sure, is that even though you have to make all kinds of compromises as a worker in higher education, or as a worker trying to keep doing research, whether you're working in an institution that's immediately legible as higher education or not, is that compromises, institutional compromises are kind of inevitable. So I guess I do think of myself as someone who has made quite a few of those too, right? But I think one hard line for me was that I did not want to be in a position where I was self-censoring in any way, or being cautious about what I said, or to not stand in solidarity with other people at the university organizing for things that I agreed with. I think that that's something that I actually perceived quite a lot in the university system, and I perceive it in the system here, right? I think in the I remember being very surprised in the US university system at just how cautious even the most protected people were. Like even the people with tenured posts, endowed chairs, and who had strong opinions about many kinds of injustices happening inside of the university were extremely cautious about speaking frankly and publicly about their views, or in standing in solidarity they were also hesitant with standing in solidarity in explicit ways with groups of people organizing against those injustices in the university. So I decided that I would never want to be in a position like that, and I would never want to do that. And if I ever felt that that was beginning to be the case, then I would rather just be a computer programmer and write on my free time. So I guess that's I guess that's where the line was drawn for me, right?
If I may add to that, I think I completely agree with Professor Ochigame, and I think it was a very similar. It's a very similar question coming from a similar place of privilege that I have been asking myself, precisely because one of my options B, C, D was also doing exactly what you said. But it's like the script in my head, which was the same script when I was thinking about the pressures in like legibility in your discipline versus like, I'm interested in this thing and I want to write about this, or I want to do this like wacky collaboration or anything of that sort. I think it's in some ways similar. Is like, one, okay, sure, there's no ethical consumption under late capitalism, but there's still like, that's not a free-for-all pass. There's still lines that you can draw for yourself. And the only thing that I kept asking myself is like, if I write it this way, or if I do actually point out the problems or causal conditions or whatever it is that I genuinely feel, and my research shows, and also I know to be true, just because it'll satisfy some administrative concerns or otherwise, which are totally true and valid. And I think so you're not overthinking yourself. What's going to happen? Like, nobody's going to give me a job? Well, in a day and age when, like, I don't know, like 1,000 people apply for a job and anyone one gets, it's anyway a lottery. So what are you optimizing for in hopes of, by like not saying what you want to say? And I think the people on the other end of the aisle also know this. Like, it's not as if anyone, sure, they want docile subjects in a very kind of Bourdieuian sense, but they know very well that there is a sense in which people are self-censoring or not. And I just think, like, you know, again, as I said, like, it's like, I treat everything that I write, especially before I got this job, I was lucky enough to get this job, I treated everything I wrote as the only thing I'll ever get to say about this thing. So there was no way that I was not going to say what I couldn't, because I was like, what if I never write about this again and I go a completely different route? And so what I really had to say was not there on the paper. Yeah, I think the cost benefit analysis is just so bad that you should do whatever you want.
Thank you. I agree that I think YOLO is underrated as a life philosophy, especially when it comes to doing this work. I do want to move on. We only have 10 minutes left. That was all so wonderful. Thank you so much for your perspectives there. We have some pointed questions for you. The first one is for you, Dr. Muir-Harmony. I'm just going to read it verbatim here. I'm wondering if you can speak to the perceived divide between someone trained as a historian and curator. I noticed that you said you knew museums earlier when you were talking about how you moved into that sphere. Did you have a good amount of curatorial experience by the time you applied to your current position? In your experience, how do museums and cultural institutions view doctoral degrees in history versus perhaps more relevant degrees such as museum studies? So we'll start with that first question. Did you have a good amount of curatorial experience by the time you applied to your position? How did you know museums?
So the knowing museums part was actually primarily beneficial to me, knowing that I'd want to apply to work at a museum. But at the Smithsonian, so in my department, when we're fully staffed, we have job searches right now, but we're fully staffed. There are 12 of us in space history, and they're all PhDs in history or history of science and technology. And there's a equal number in aeronautics, and then it's similar in the other museums around the National Mall. And so the training that's expected is actually PhD training in history of science, technology. So you don't need to come in with museum studies. It's actually, I don't know if that would have even helped me if I had that background. But it was useful for me. So I had internships and fellowships in museums. When I was doing my master's work at Notre Dame, I was working at a museum in Chicago, the Adler Planetarium. And so I got exposure there, which was useful because that's a different museum. And so I got a good sense of some of the diversity, and then also did some stuff with the MIT Museum. And then there was a class at MIT when I was there on science museums. And so had that familiarity, but mainly what that did is sort of open my horizons, like widen my eyes to other possibilities. But for institutions like the Smithsonian and also the Adler, I believe really what the hiring for was expertise within history of science and technology or anthropology. I mean, it is broader than history.
Thank you. So our next question is for Professor Dhaliwal. So what advice would you have for someone who is a philosopher whose research aims primarily at technology and its impact on society in terms of which institutions to apply to, who to engage with? So I'm not sure if this question is specifically directed or oriented toward those who have training in philosophy. Yeah, I'll just repeat the question. What advice would you have for someone who is a philosopher whose research aims primarily at technology and its impact on society, in terms of which institutions to apply to or who to engage with? Do you have any advice there?
I'm not sure I have any specific advice because I'm personally not trained in philosophy, and all of us here are trained in forms of science and technology studies. But I do think that this is something that I kind of hinted at early on, is like, I was given this advice, which I found to be really useful, is that there is two kinds of, all of these categorizations and taxonomies are terrible and of no use, but they're useful to spin out words. There are two kinds of sort of targeted attacks that you can do on the job market as a candidate. One is do the thing that you do, the very kind of specific subdiscipline that you're in. And when those jobs open up in those specific kinds of institutions, be that, R1 or be that teaching heavy institutions or institutions that are not universities per se, know that like your expertise in that specific subdiscipline would stand you in good stead, and that you're probably likely to be, in the conversation, if nothing else. And then there is like, which the second part, which I think was like kind of my approach, which was like, I could be like, I do a political economic history and theory of technology, and then I'm applying for those jobs. But then I wouldn't be applying for the job that I am in right now, because that's not what the job was advertised for. And in that case, I think it's because the search committees are also of two kinds. They're either the ones looking to fill a gap in the offerings of the department. They want to hire an 18th century ex-scholar. And so if you are a very good 18th century ex-scholar, great, this is the job that you apply for. But then there are committees which want to hire an 18th century ex-scholar insofar as they care about that thing being taught in the department, but they don't really care about that as being the only thing that you may or may not do. And so they're just looking for a colleague, in which case any and every job is like kind of open for it, as long as you think that you would not hate it. So I was actually very shocked by the kinds of jobs that I got callbacks from, and the kinds of jobs that I was like, well, that's literally what I do. That's my description. And I heard nothing. And then the job also like ended up going to people who didn't do anything of that description. So what they were looking for is always opaque, and that's fine. But ask yourself, if you are a one target candidate, which can be extremely successful in certain kind of institutions, or like a multi-target candidate, which is probably also more work. So I'm not sure I'm advising one over the other, but I'm just pointing out that there are multiple ways of approaching the market and the kinds of institutions you're looking for.
Great, thank you so much. So we have 5 minutes left. I'd like to open the floor to either our panelists, if you have any parting advice or any last thoughts, and also to our participants, if you have any questions that you want to pose to our panelists before we part ways. I guess I'll ask each of you then. I feel like this could be something helpful to close off future sessions with. You've given so much advice, naming it as such, over the course of the last hour and a half. But if you had to choose one piece of advice to give graduate students that you did not necessarily, that you wish you'd heard in graduate school, that was in the pitch for the panel, I'm realizing now. Yeah, what do you wish you had heard as a graduate student before embarking upon your professional journey? This one is very open-ended and philosophical. Yes, Professor Ochigame.
Okay. Okay, so to respond to the open-ended and philosophical, I will go with a piece of meta advice. So, well, one thing that was extremely important for me, and that and its importance became clearer with time, was that it was very important for me to have sources of advice and support that had an attitude of not internalizing the dynamics of the labor market at all. Okay, so you have mentors, for example, who could tell you, in a kind of straightforward way, what the norms and tacit expectations of the labor market were, while maintaining complete distance from it. Okay? And I must say that for the most part, most people are not like that. Right? Like most people I talked to had varying degrees of internalizing the norms and expectations of that labor market. And I've always felt a kind of sense of distance and alienness from them because of that. And I think that the few people who had served as mentors for me, who were able to maintain that distance and say, hey, it's a horrible system out there. I mean, we don't care about that. And we care about other things. But if you must engage with it as a wage worker, here's the strategic advice I have for you, and people who could keep that attitude, I think, were absolutely vital for me, and I intend to do the same when I'm in the role of giving advice. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can go next. I think this is a tough question for me personally to answer, because generally I'm extremely critical of institutions, but the ecologies that I was surrounded by for my grad school actually gave me wonderful advice and most of the things that I needed to know. So the grad program had a very robust job market preparation plan that not all grad programs have. In fact, most don't. That actually did help, even if I myself was like a little outside of their purview, because my connection with English is somewhat tangential for most people doing that work. But then I had very good advice. So it's kind of tough for me to point out what I did not get advice on. But I do wish that earlier on in my, I got that advice like sometime in the middle of my grad school, and I had by that figured that out myself. But I do wish that I was more explicitly told to not be, to kind of optimize my grad life for not being miserable day to day, which is to say that, like, build solidarities with people that are at your career level, because they're the ones who you're going to hang out with, and they're the ones who you're going to think together with, and they're the ones who probably even actually care for you and you care for them, instead of like doing some kind of networking that goes like upside down, which it works in a very different approach. So I think I wish I was told earlier that I'm here to like make friends and think together instead of anything else that may have to do with job market. Because again, I think just like statistically speaking, it's not advisable to give advice that's tailored in any way towards job market. I think we can only give advice to be like, how do we, live in, I don't know, a more sort of conscious way in this day and age. So that's all I have to say.
You've actually almost directly echoed at the end of our panel in October, Professor Kim Tallbear, I remember it almost word for word, but I am paraphrasing here, said that her advice was not to think of the academy as a home, but as a tool to forge pathways where other people can follow where you have walked, and also to make it more tolerable for other people within the institution itself. So seems like y'all are on the same page with that. Dr. Muir-Harmony.
I think it's hard to know exactly what to say. I do agree that the friendships that you form are extremely important, and so many of the people that you will meet in graduate school are fascinating people that you will continue to know for many years, hopefully, and then also that it is a great privilege that we all have, that we have this opportunity to spend years learning about something that we're really deeply passionate about, and no matter what comes of it, that is a fact. It's a great privilege, even though there are issues with it. And even though on a day-to-day, it can be hard to be, there were definitely days at graduate school I woke up and didn't feel that privilege, but it was always. And no matter what happens next, and no matter what you do with those opportunities and experiences, that it is something that is quite lucky to experience in many ways. And so, and then that opportunity to build friendships and build a community that you find can, keep you learning as you continue out through your entire life.
Great, thank you so much. So we have arrived at the end of this discussion. Again, I want to thank all of our panelists. That was a really fantastic conversation. And to everybody who joined us, thank you so much. I have a list of people who want to be added to the mailing list so you can learn about future events. But yes, thanks to everyone for adding to the chat, for your wonderful questions, and for your really great contribution, our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.